My name is Nico, and you're watching Frontline Reports, where we go beyond the headlines to bring you the stories that are quietly reshaping our world. Tonight, we are not going to skim the surface. We are going to go deep. We are going to pull back the curtain on one of the most consequential and least fully understood geopolitical alignments of our time. 10 powerful nations that are openly, deliberately, and in some cases defiantly standing behind Iran. Not because they all love Iran, not because they all share the same ideology, but because for very different reasons, every single one of them has decided that backing Iran serves their own national interests, and that the cost of doing so is worth paying, even in the face of American pressure. By the time this story is done, you will understand something that most news coverage gets wrong. This is not simply a story about Iran. This is a story about the fracturing of an entire global order, one that the United States spent 70 years building, and the emergence of something new, something messy, something that no one fully controls. Stay with us. This one matters. Before we can talk about who is backing Iran and why, we need to understand what exactly it is they are backing. Because Iran is not just any country, and its position on the global chessboard is not an accident of history. It is a product of geography, resources, military capability, and political will that has made it one of the most consequential nations on Earth. Let's start with location. Iran sits at one of the most strategically significant crossroads on the entire planet, the point where the Middle East meets Central Asia and the Caucasus. It shares borders with Turkey, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan. It has coastlines on both the Caspian Sea to the north and the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman to the south. In any serious discussion of Eurasian trade, energy supply, or military projection, Iran is simply impossible to route around. It is the geographic pivot of an enormous and enormously important region. Then there is population. With more than 88 million people, Iran is one of the most populous nations in the Middle East and broader region. It has a large, relatively educated workforce, a complex domestic economy, and a young population that, despite decades of economic pressure, continues to produce engineers, scientists, physicians, and military personnel at scale. This is not a fragile state on the verge of collapse. This is a country with genuine institutional depth. Now let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz, because this is where Iran's geographic position translates into raw global power. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the open ocean beyond. At its narrowest point, it is just 21 miles wide. And yet, through this slender passage flows approximately 20% of the entire world's daily oil supply. Saudi Arabia's oil exports pass through it. Iraq's oil passes through it. The UAE's oil passes through it. Kuwait's, Qatar's natural gas. In energy terms, the Strait of Hormuz is the single most important choke point on Earth. Iran doesn't just border the Strait of Hormuz, it dominates it. Iranian territory forms the entire northern shore of the waterway. Iranian naval forces patrol it. Iranian missiles are positioned along its coastline. The message this sends to every oil-importing nation on Earth, from China to Japan to South Korea to India to half of Europe, is simple and unmistakable. Media: montage of oil import terminals in China, Japan, South Korea, India, and European ports. Global leaders at Energy Summit. Whatever you think of Iran politically, you cannot afford to make it an enemy without understanding the consequences for your own energy security. Even a temporary disruption to traffic through the strait, whether through direct military action or deliberate signaling, could send global energy prices into shock and trigger economic pain across dozens of countries simultaneously. And beyond the strait, Iran's own energy wealth is staggering. According to the United States Energy Information Administration, not exactly an organization with any sympathy for Tehran, Iran holds the second largest proven natural gas reserves on the planet. only Russia has more. In crude oil, Iran ranks fourth globally in proven reserves. These are figures that command the attention of every major energy importing economy in the world, regardless of political alignment. Then there is the military dimension. Over 4 decades of economic pressure and international isolation, Iran has done something remarkable. It has built one of the most sophisticated asymmetric warfare capabilities in the world. Rather than competing with the United States by trying to build a conventional military force that could match American aircraft carriers and stealth fighters, which it could never afford, Iran invested heavily in a different kind of power. Long-range ballistic missiles capable of hitting targets anywhere across the Middle East and parts of Europe. Precision-guided munitions, advanced drone technology, cyber capabilities that have been credited with attacks on everything from Saudi oil infrastructure to American banking systems. And perhaps most consequentially, an extensive network of proxy and allied armed groups that extend Iranian reach far beyond its own borders. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, multiple armed factions in both Iraq and Syria. Through these proxies, Iran can project military pressure on Israel, on Saudi Arabia, on American military installations, and on international shipping without ever formally declaring war. And then there is the nuclear question, the one that looms over every other dimension of this story. Since 2021, Iran has dramatically accelerated its nuclear enrichment program. Reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, have repeatedly confirmed that Iran has enriched uranium to purity levels approaching those needed for a weapon. Whether Iran has made the final political decision to actually build a nuclear device remains, as of now, unconfirmed by Western intelligence agencies. But the technical capability to do so, if the political decision were made, has narrowed to a time frame measured in weeks rather than years. This is the country that the United States has spent 40+ years trying to contain. And this, right now at this particular moment in history, is the country that 10 significant nations have chosen to support. To answer the why now question honestly, you have to be willing to zoom out far enough to see the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is this. The international order that the United States constructed after the Second World War is under more serious structural stress than at any point in the past 7 decades. After 1945, America didn't just win a war, it built a world. The Bretton Woods financial architecture established the US dollar as the anchor of the global monetary system and created institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that Washington wielded with enormous influence. The United Nations Security Council gave America a permanent veto over collective international action. NATO bound the richest and most militarily capable democracies in Europe and beyond into a security arrangement that Washington led. American military bases spread across every inhabited continent, in Japan, South Korea, Germany, the Gulf, East Africa, and dozens of other locations. And underneath all of it ran the assumption that had become so deeply embedded as to seem like a natural law. The United States sets the rules, and countries that break them face consequences. For roughly 70 years, despite contradictions and occasional crises, that system held. American credibility, the belief that Washington would both enforce the rules and abide by them, kept the structure stable. But that credibility has been eroding, slowly and then rapidly, through a series of events that many countries in the global South and even within the traditional Western alliance watched with quiet alarm. The American invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified on the basis of weapons of mass destruction that did not exist, was the first major crack. More than any single event before it, the Iraq War demonstrated to watching governments around the world that American power, when deployed unilaterally, was not reliably guided by the rules and principles that Washington publicly championed. The invasion killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, destabilized an entire region, and was never genuinely held to account in any international forum. The message absorbed by smaller nations was uncomfortable. American power operates above the very law it claims to uphold. The 2008 global financial crisis delivered the second major blow. The collapse originated within American financial institutions, the product of reckless deregulation, speculative excess, and criminal negligence that went largely unpunished on Wall Street. But the damage did not stay in America. It spread across the globe. Banks failed in Iceland, unemployment spiked in Spain and Portugal, pension funds evaporated in countries that had nothing to do with American mortgage-backed securities. The crisis forced governments around the world to ask a question that would have seemed almost heretical a decade earlier. Is American economic leadership actually safe to depend on? Then came Afghanistan. The chaotic, disorganized American withdrawal in August 2021, which left thousands of Afghan allies scrambling for their lives as the Taliban swept back into Kabul within days of the last American soldier departing, broadcast to every foreign capital something about the limits and the reliability of American military commitment. The message was not lost on allies or adversaries alike. But perhaps the development that has done the most to reshape the behavior of countries across the global south has been America's aggressive use of financial infrastructure as a weapon. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency gives the United States a form of power that is genuinely unique. The ability to cut off any country's access to the global financial system simply by denying them access to dollar clearing mechanisms. When America imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, expelling Russian banks from the SWIFT global messaging system, freezing hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian central bank reserves, coordinating a Western financial blockade of unprecedented scale, governments around the world took notice. Not because they sympathized with Russia's invasion, many of them were deeply uncomfortable with it, but because they watched America demonstrate in the starkest possible terms that access to the global financial system could be revoked almost overnight, that reserves held in Western institutions were not necessarily safe, and that any country Washington decided to target could be economically isolated from the global economy within days. The question that began circulating quietly in finance ministries and presidential offices from Brasilia to Jakarta to Riyadh was not a theoretical one. It was intensely practical. What happens if, one day, the disagreement with Washington is ours? That question is now driving concrete behavior. Countries are diversifying their reserve holdings away from dollars. They are developing alternative payment mechanisms that bypass the dollar system. They are deepening trade relationships with non-Western partners, and they are reconsidering their willingness to enforce American sanctions against countries that Washington designates as adversaries, particularly when doing so comes at a direct cost to their own economic interests. Iran, paradoxically, has become something of a symbol and a guide in this reconfiguration. Having survived more than 4 decades of American sanctions, the longest sustained economic pressure campaign in modern history, Iran represents proof that it is possible to function, however painfully, outside the American-led system. For countries looking to build insurance against their own potential exposure to American financial pressure, Iran's experience is, really instructive. And the countries now standing behind Iran are not simply expressing solidarity with Tehran. Many of them are using the Iran relationship as a building block in the construction of an alternative architecture, one that gives them more room to maneuver, more protection from American coercion, and more strategic options in a world that is changing faster than the institutions designed to govern it. With that context firmly established, let us now turn to the 10 countries themselves. Each one brings different motivations, different assets, and different risks to this alignment. And together, they paint a picture that is far more consequential than any single bilateral relationship. If there is one country on this list whose support for Iran has attracted the most attention, the most alarm in Western capitals, and the most military consequence on the ground, it is Russia. The Russia-Iran relationship is one of history's more striking examples of how shared enemies can transform ancient rivals into effective partners. These are two countries that spent much of the past 2 centuries in conflict or competition with each other. Russian and Persian empires fought multiple wars throughout the 19th century, with Russia consistently advancing southward at Persia's expense, seizing territories in the Caucasus, and extracting trade concessions that deeply humiliated the Persian court. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and Iran were adversaries. Iran under the Shah was firmly in the American camp, hosting American intelligence facilities that monitored Soviet communications from its northern border. Even after the Islamic Revolution of 1979 replaced the Shah with Ayatollah Khomeini, relations between Moscow and Tehran remained complicated, with the Soviets backing Iraq during the brutal 8-year war that killed hundreds of thousands on both sides. In the years following the Soviet collapse, the relationship slowly improved, but never became genuinely warm. Arms sales happened. Diplomatic contacts were maintained, but the two countries retained deep mutual suspicion. What changed everything was Syria. When the Syrian civil war erupted in 2011 and by 2015 had brought Bashar al-Assad's government to the brink of collapse, both Russia and Iran found themselves with converging reasons to intervene. For Russia, the fall of Assad would mean the loss of its only significant military presence in the Mediterranean, the naval base at Tartus, and the humiliation of watching a government it backed crumble under Western-backed pressure. For Iran, the fall of Assad would sever the crucial land corridor through which it supplied Hezbollah in Lebanon, gutting its entire regional strategy at a stroke. The two countries intervened separately at first, then increasingly in concert. Russia provided the air power and the diplomatic cover. Iran provided the ground forces, the financing, and the organizational structure of allied militias drawn from Lebanon, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. Assad survived, and in saving him together, Russia and Iran discovered something important: that they could work effectively as strategic partners when their interests aligned. Then came Ukraine, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022 and quickly discovered that the Ukrainian military, equipped and advised by NATO intelligence and weapons, was far more formidable than anticipated. Moscow found itself in urgent need of battlefield capabilities it had underestimated. It turned to Iran. Iran delivered. The Shahed series attack drones, relatively cheap to produce, difficult to intercept at scale, capable of flying hundreds of kilometers to strike fixed targets, began appearing over Ukrainian cities by the autumn of 2022. Western and Ukrainian intelligence assessments estimated that Iran supplied Russia with several hundred of these drones in the initial deliveries, with discussions ongoing about expanding cooperation to include more advanced ballistic missile systems. The transaction was not one-sided. In exchange for Iranian military hardware, Russia has provided Iran with something equally valuable: political protection. As a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council with an absolute veto, Russia can block any resolution targeting Iran, regardless of how many other members support it. Russia has used this veto power consistently. Beyond diplomatic cover, Moscow and Tehran have engaged in discussions about Russian supply of advanced air defense systems to Iran, technology that would significantly complicate any military campaign against Iranian territory. Economic cooperation has deepened substantially as well, with bilateral trade volumes growing significantly after 2022 as both countries sought to route commerce around Western sanctions and export controls. The North-South Transport Corridor, a multimodal logistics route connecting Russian ports in the Baltic to Iranian ports on the Persian Gulf, with onward connections to the Indian Ocean, has gained renewed strategic significance as both countries invest in the infrastructure needed to move goods without crossing through Western-controlled or Western-aligned trade routes. The vision is ambitious, a supply chain that runs from St. Petersburg to Mumbai without a single container ever touching a Western port or passing through a Western-controlled choke point. Russia and Iran have also aligned within multilateral institutions. Both are members or partners in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Both have deepened their engagement with BRICS. Their coordination at these forums represents not just bilateral alignment, but active participation in constructing the architecture of an alternative international order. It would be a mistake, however, to romanticize this relationship. Russia and Iran are not friends in any warm or ideological sense. They have competing interests in Central Asia, differing views on the future of the Caspian region, and a long institutional memory of mutual betrayal. What holds them together is not affection but calculation, the recognition that in a world where both face sustained American pressure, alignment with each other is more strategically valuable than the alternative. If Russia is the most militarily significant of Iran's supporters, China is unquestionably the most economically consequential. And the scale of China's engagement with Iran, the depth, the breadth, the long-term commitment, is something that does not receive nearly enough attention in Western media coverage. In March 2021, Beijing and Tehran signed what has been described by regional analysts as one of the most sweeping bilateral partnership agreements of the 21st century. The 25-year Comprehensive Cooperation Agreement between China and Iran covers an extraordinary range of sectors: infrastructure development, energy extraction, transportation networks, port construction, telecommunications, and defense cooperation. The headline investment figures are staggering, with Chinese commitments reportedly totaling up to $400 billion spread across the 25-year lifespan of the agreement, though actual disbursement has proceeded more slowly than the headline number implies. What matters, though, is not just the money. It is the strategic signal the agreement sends. China is willing to be Iran's economic backstop regardless of what Washington thinks about it. The logic driving Beijing's commitment is layered and deliberate. At the most basic level, China is the world's single largest importer of oil, and Iranian crude, heavily discounted because Iranian sellers have extremely limited legitimate market options under sanctions, represents an enormous bargain. Chinese refineries have been absorbing Iranian oil at prices substantially below global market rates, reducing China's overall energy costs while simultaneously giving Tehran a revenue stream that keeps its government functioning. This is not charity. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement in which China receives cheap energy and Iran receives economic survival. At a structural level, Iran is a critical node in China's Belt and Road Initiative, the trillion-dollar infrastructure and connectivity project that Beijing has been constructing across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe over the past decade. Iran sits at the geographic center of multiple proposed Belt and Road corridors. It is the bridge between Central Asia and the Persian Gulf. It connects Chinese investment in Pakistan and Afghanistan to markets in Turkey and Europe. Without Iranian participation and goodwill, several of the most ambitious Belt and Road routes are simply not viable. Iran is not a peripheral participant in Beijing's global infrastructure vision. It is close to central. But the deepest motivation for China's Iran policy is political and philosophical. Beijing views the American use of sanctions, the weaponization of dollar dominance and access to the global financial system to punish countries that Washington disapproves of, as a fundamental threat to Chinese sovereignty and strategic freedom. Chinese policymakers are acutely aware that if U.S.-China tensions over Taiwan or trade or technology escalate significantly, Washington could attempt to use the same financial weapons against China that it has deployed against Iran and Russia. By standing publicly and unapologetically beside Iran, by providing the economic infrastructure that allows Tehran to survive American pressure, Beijing is not just helping Iran. It is demonstrating to the world, and particularly to countries in the global south that face their own vulnerabilities to American financial pressure, that there is an alternative, that China will provide backing, that the American sanctions tool is not as absolute or as decisive as Washington wants the world to believe. Chinese state media has been deliberate and consistent in framing the Beijing-Tehran relationship in civilizational terms. Two ancient cultures, one stretching back to the Persian Empire, one to the Han Dynasty, reclaiming their proper place in the world order after centuries of Western interference. It is a narrative that resonates powerfully within both countries and that carries a specific political message to the rest of the developing world. Alignment with China means alignment with a rising power that respects history, rejects Western condescension, and offers partnership rather than conditions. The practical depth of the relationship is visible in everyday Iranian life. Chinese telecommunications infrastructure, including equipment from Huawei, reportedly forms a significant portion of Iran's communications backbone. Chinese manufactured vehicles have become dominant on Iranian roads as Western brands departed. Chinese companies have moved into manufacturing, agricultural supply chains, pharmaceutical distribution, and retail sectors that Western sanctions evacuated. The economic integration between China and Iran is no longer shallow or easily reversible. It runs through the Iranian economy at a structural level. If the China-Iran relationship is the most economically significant partnership on this list, the North Korea-Iran partnership is arguably the most technically alarming and the most consequential for global security. The relationship between Pyongyang and Tehran is not a recent development. It was forged under fire, literally, during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, when Iran found itself facing an Iraqi military that was being armed and supported,